My name is Dominic Tompa, and I'm president of Daniels Realty. I'm pleased to be joined this afternoon with Adam Molson, who's the vice president of rental communities and sustainability for the Daniels Corporation. Adam, we recently unveiled our Daniels Decarbonization Roadmap. Can you tell us what was announced and specifically, how does it affect the communities we're building?
Sure, Dominic. So real estate and new construction in particular is a significant source of carbon emissions. And I think we're all aware that there's a great pressure out there for the world to decarbonize, to get to net zero. And so for us, we've taken a look at our business and said, how can we do more? How can we push on this issue as fast as possible? We're not waiting for regulation. We're not waiting for government to tell us what and how to do it. We know our business better than anyone else. And so we're proactively saying, we want to be here leading on this issue. And we've come out with a public-facing plan that we're going to hold ourselves accountable to about how we can decarbonize our business. And so specifically, the plan outlines 2 generations of performance that's going to guide everything that we're building over the next 7 to 8 years. And we're ratcheting down our performance, and we're hoping by 2026 to get to a near zero carbon level of performance that would represent a 64% reduction in emissions relative to the baseline of what we've just been building. And so we're very excited about that.
Adam, you mentioned low carbon a couple of times in your answer, and it's something we hear a lot when people are talking about sustainable communities, and we hear low carbon and sustainable. But I think to the average person, I'm not sure if we all understand what that means. What does that mean from a standpoint of construction, and then what does it mean from a standpoint of how people live in that community?
Okay, so that's a really great question, Dominic. And it's something I'm really happy to talk about because sustainability gets thrown around a lot. It's kind of become this catch-all that someone applies to anything notionally connected with the environment. And really, we find that tends to lead to a bit of greenwashing. And so we were very intentional when we developed this roadmap that we wanted to talk about low carbon in particular. And why? Because climate change is here and it's an existential threat for our society, for our species. And so we're not looking to make broad strokes something that sounds good. We actually want to do something meaningful to attack what we believe is a crisis that we're all facing. And so low carbon is a component of sustainability, but for us it's the #1 issue. If we don't fix this, if we don't solve this, none of these other things matter. We're not going to have a home. We're not going to have a planet to live on. And so we very intentionally decided to focus on low carbon. And so what does that actually mean? So within the context of real estate, carbon generally comes from 2 aspects. So one, there's building a building. You're going and you're extracting raw materials, you're processing them, you're bringing them to site, you're erecting them into a building. That emits a significant source of emissions. The second component is once the building is completed and it's on, you're running your lights, you're heating it, all of those things, that's your operational emissions. And so together, that's the real estate impact of real estate, and again, is a significant contributor to climate change today. And so when we're coming in, we're saying, we know as the developer and the builder, we're designing and building these communities that yes, emits emissions through the construction process, but then also how we've designed them really sets them up for the future. And the end users who are coming in, you know, they're essentially just working with what they have. And so we have a tremendous opportunity and indeed a responsibility to come in and set people up on the right path and give them homes that allow them to not be a part of the climate problem, but actually be part of the solution.
And that's very interesting. In terms of, we're in the middle of a lot going on sale with Mount Pleasant Village 2. Can you tell us in that community what we're doing as far as making it a low carbon community? And then the other part of the answer, if you could, is we've been using terminology of eco-urban community. What makes Mount Pleasant Village 2 an eco-urban community?
Sure. So to talk about the low carbon aspect first, MPV2 has 2 components to it. It has a mid-rise tower and it has 7 blocks of townhouses. And they each take a slightly different approach. On the mid-rise, the headline strategy there is that we're using Geoexchange energy. And so a typical building, most of what we've built and sold over the last number of decades would use natural gas for heating and hot water. Natural gas is a fossil fuel. You burn it to get the energy, and that emits a number of carbon dioxide emissions. Geoexchange is completely electrically based, so there's no fossil fuels involved. All of those emissions go away. And essentially what you're doing is you're taking advantage of the earth and using it as a sort of thermal battery. And so what that means is in the summertime, when you're trying to cool a building, you don't actually generate cooling. What you do is you take heating and you pull it out of the building. And in the Geoexchange, you take that heat, you pull it out of the building, and you actually put it in the ground. And then in the winter, you're going and you're taking advantage of all that heat you put in the ground and you pull it back out and you put it back into the building. And again, this is all electrically powered, so it has a huge reduction in emissions. And so we're very excited about this. We're partnering with Enwave, one of the best-in-class providers in the Greater Toronto Area, as our Geoexchange partner.
So you mentioned electrically powered, and I wanted to ask you this question because what we hear a lot in the real estate marketplace is, I think, is probably, and you can correct this, is a misconception that heating using electricity is more expensive than fossil fuel. Is that a misperception, or can you tell us a little bit more about how these systems work?
Yeah, like a lot of things, there's a small kernel of truth to that, but it's not the whole story. And so on a one-to-one basis, yes, electricity is a little bit more expensive than gas, but again, that's very volatile. Electricity is generally more stable as a commodity. It's all generated locally in Ontario. We have a great deal of control as a society over the cost of that. Natural gas is based on international commodity markets. We've seen with this most recent geopolitical event being the Russian invasion of Ukraine, huge swings and spikes in the cost of natural gas due to these external factors that are really beyond the control of our jurisdiction in Ontario. So there's a lot of volatility there. And so yes, maybe a year or 2 years ago, gas was cheaper than electricity. Today, it actually is not. Tomorrow, we'll see what the future holds. But at the end of the day, it's volatile and it's risky. In any event, even if you put that aside, the traditional sense of electricity being expensive, I think, is based on stuff from the 70s and the 80s, where people went to electric baseboard heaters, which were a very inefficient electrical technology. The things that we're using today, the Geoexchange, the air source heat pumps in the townhouses that I'll talk a little about, they're way more efficient. And so what we're doing is the amount of electricity that these projects require are tremendously reduced from maybe what you would have seen in an electrically based project in the past. So all put together, it means that the total cost of ownership when it comes to your utility bills for these electric communities is comparable to what people are used to. And I would argue, in fact, a much safer investment in the long term because you remove that risk and that volatility by switching to a fuel source that's produced closer to home.
That's very interesting because I was just about to ask you something related to that, and you mentioned that the total cost of ownership is very similar. And obviously, I think that most people, if they have the opportunity to do something that's good for the environment and for the future, they want to do it, but they're always concerned about the cost of living, the cost of living in a home. And I've heard a reference to buying into a community like this as future-proofing your investment, or that the value proposition makes a lot of sense, not just immediately, but in the future as building changes right across the board, not just Daniels who's leading the way, but the entire industry. Can you speak to that a bit?
Sure. So going back on the cost of ownership, this isn't the first time we've built a project like this. We actually piloted a lot of these technologies in this concept of an all-electric community in Regent Park a couple years ago with our Fieldhouse Towns project. And so they're very similar to the townhouses at MPV2. We brought to market systems that were fully electrically based, built them, turned them over. That project's been up in operation for about 1.5 years now. We've been working with the condominium corporation, our metering provider there, to make sure that we validate all of the designs and modeling that we put out there to ensure that the promises and the representations we were making did in fact bear out. And I'm very happy to report they have at Fieldhouse. We've seen the data, we know what people are paying on a monthly basis, and we can say confidently, we built this, we've proven out that it does work. These people are paying monthly costs that are very comparable to what they would have seen on traditional projects. So first of all, there is some track record, I guess, or some assurance on that side. And then looking ahead to the value proposition, I think the the world and the realm that we're entering to over the next decades is a lot different than what have all been used to over the last few decades. And this is in a number of areas. You know, the post-Cold War environment was very unique. It was very stable. There's a lot of predictability. We're seeing now inflation peaking, you know, geopolitical crises, all these things that I think signal the world is going into maybe a little bit more of a tumultuous time. At the same time, I think the public has a general awareness of the climate crisis and the fact that there's tremendous global pressure to get to net zero and to reduce carbon emissions. And we're starting to see the policy reality of that in the day-to-day life. And so an example of that would be Canada recently announcing that by 2035, you will no longer be able to sell or purchase a gas-powered vehicle. That's phasing out fossil fuels in the transportation sector. We've already seen jurisdictions such as Vancouver introduce regulations saying that, I believe it was as of, I think last year, you can no longer put in a gas furnace in a new home in Vancouver. Quebec also introduced regulations that as of 2024, if you're replacing a furnace, you can't replace a gas furnace with a gas furnace as of 2024. It has to be a emissions-free heating system, which really means electrical. So we're already seeing that this is happening. So if you're about to buy a home, that's probably the biggest investment in your life. And this is something that doesn't last for a year or 2 years. This is something that lasts for 40, 50, 60 years. Why would you be buying something that's yesterday's technology, that the writing is clearly on the wall, that within the next 10 or so years, there could be very punitive policies forcing you to retrofit and remove all your fossil fuel-based systems. For us, it's just a wise decision to commit to electrically today, especially when we've demonstrated that you can buy electrically today without a premium on the upfront side or on the long-term operations. We just think it's tremendous value.
Adam, I want to ask a couple of specific questions about terminologies that you hear out there in the marketplace, and I think a lot of people don't really understand what they mean. The first one is, what is a net zero home?
Yeah, so let me answer that in the context of MPV2 actually. At MPV2, the townhouses are both net zero energy and net zero carbon. And so what that means is on the energy side of the equation, those townhouses actually generate the same amount of energy that they consume. So we've done everything we can to reduce the energy consumption, make them more efficient, and then at the same time, we've completely covered the roofs with solar panels so that we're generating emissions-free renewable energy right on site that's equivalent to what they're using. So while they are connected to the electric grid for resiliency purpose, essentially they're not drawing any net energy from the grid. They're self-sufficient in that regard. On the carbon side, again, because all the energy that they're generating is from these solar panels that are emissions-free, they're actually net zero carbon as well. So on a net basis, they're not emitting anything into the atmosphere.
Well, that's really fantastic. Adam, you mentioned earlier that at MPV2, there'll be a Geoexchange system. What exactly does that mean and how does it work?
Yeah, so like we talked about earlier, Geoexchange essentially takes advantage of the Earth to function as a thermal battery. And so how does that happen? What we do is we bring in a drill rig and we drill a bunch of holes deep into the Earth. We actually did this already at MPV2. We did it last fall. And in this case, it was 59 holes that we drilled to an 850-foot depth. Within each hole, we then put in a closed circuit bit of piping and fill it with a fluid that acts as a heat exchange medium. And so that then gets connected to mechanical equipment in the building. Again, if we're pulling heat out of the building in the summer to help cool it down, that through a heat exchanger gets put into that fluid and then circulated into those holes, 850 foot deep, and then it sort of bleeds out into the earth around it. It warms up the ground. And then in the winter, you're essentially reversing that. You're pulling the heat out of the ground, bringing it back into those tubes and the fluid, bringing it up to the building and using the heat exchanger to then distribute it through the common areas and suites.
Well, it's really inspiring to hear what we're doing at MPV2. Adam, would you say that to date, this would be the most advanced low carbon sustainable building that we've done in a community so far? And what is Daniel's plan in the future?
Yeah, absolutely. Without a doubt, this is our most advanced project yet. Again, with the release of the decarbonization roadmap, we're looking to be much more intentional and strategic across our portfolio and really build on each project one after the other. So I mentioned Fieldhouse Towns earlier. That was our pilot into electrification. We took all the lessons that we learned we optimized them, we improved them, we made them better, and then we're deploying it at a much larger scale here at MPV2. We're going to do the same thing here, continue to refine, develop these as a best practice, and then see how can we push the envelope even further on the next project. So this, while it's the most advanced today, I see it as the floor for what's to come.
Adam, we've been talking a lot about low carbon communities, but specifically, what is Daniels doing to be more transparent about carbon in the community?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked that because we're actually really excited that here at MPV2, we're launching for the first time our carbon label. This is something that's completely voluntary, but it's a disclosure of the specific performance of the building. We're not just coming out here and saying, trust us, it's low carbon. We're actually giving hard numbers of this is how many kilograms of carbon dioxide are emitted for each meter squared of floor space in the building. And so what we're hoping is this does a number of things. One, it allows people to understand, or at least start to wrap their head around the connection between emissions and real estate. A smaller unit has a lower footprint. It's less square footage. The other thing we're hoping to do is that it's going to really bring accountability for us. People are going to see, okay, MPV2, it performed at this level. Well, maybe I don't quite have the context for that or know exactly what that means, but then at our next launch, they can see that, hey, we actually came in a little bit lower, and they can see that we're making progress and there's real traction, I guess, on this issue. The other thing we're hoping is that it helps spur the industry as a whole to be a little bit more accountable. If we're out here on a voluntary basis saying, this is exactly the emissions associated with the suite you're buying, that's going to prompt the buyers and the end users to talk to others in our industry and say, okay, well, Daniels is starting to tell me that this is the climate change or the carbon impact of their suites that they're selling. What about you guys? And through this, we're all going to push each other to be better. Maybe get a little bit of a healthy competition going on. That's something I'd love to see, that we're all trying to one-up each other in terms of who can build the lowest carbon building.
Well, Adam, I think this has been a wonderful conversation, and I think we've all learned so much about Daniels and low carbon building. If anyone was interested in learning a bit more about it, how could they find out what we're doing?
Sure. So our website is an excellent source of information. We are publishing our roadmap, which goes into much greater detail than we've had the chance to talk about here, about all the ins and outs of our roadmap and our plan. MPV2, also the website there has a lot more information about the specific tactics we're taking in that community. And then again, our team. So whether it's Daniels Realty or anyone else associated with Daniels, we're all very excited about this issue. And so really come talk to us. We're happy to talk about it. The whole intent of this is that we want people to go on this journey with us. We want to educate people. We want to bring the conversation up and turn this into a positive thing. So much that's out there right now is we're behind, we're not doing enough. And what we want this to be is an empowering conversation to say, no, we actually can do something. It doesn't have to be a huge sacrifice. It doesn't have to cost a ton more. We just have to be intentional about it. We have to care, and we have to commit to it.
Adam, thank you very much.